there comes a moment in life when everything you've built starts to feel insufficient. The achievements are there, the recognition exists, but something inside you whispers that substance is missing. It's not ingratitude or a superficial crisis of meaning. It's the psyche signaling that one phase has ended and another needs to begin. Carl Jung called this a necessary transition, the point where adaptation to the external world gives way to the discovery of the internal world. And this usually happens around 40 years old. Jung divided life into two major distinct psychological phases. The first half is dedicated to expansion, to conquering space in the world, to building external territory. You learn the rules of the social game, build a functional identity, find your place in the collective hierarchy. All psychic energy is directed outward, toward building careers, proving worth, belonging to groups. It's centrifugal movement, where the center of gravity is in the external world and its demands. The second half requires the opposite movement, centripetal. Energy needs to return inward to find what was left aside during the race for acceptance and social survival. It's not optional, not a luxury for those with time to spare. It's a natural and inevitable psychological process, and ignoring it generates consequences that manifest as neuroses, existential emptiness, depression without apparent cause, or what many call the midlife crisis. Youth is not a time for deep internal realization. It's a time for preparation for life, for building foundations. You're too busy building the bases of adult life to question who you really are beneath social expectations. All the energy goes toward finding romantic partners, establishing a professional career, forming a family, achieving financial stability, buying a house, creating a reputation. These are legitimate and absolutely necessary tasks for survival in the adult world, but they're tasks of external adaptation, not internal individuation. The young psyche isn't mature enough yet to deal with deep existential questions without getting lost in them. It first needs to guarantee social survival, create stable structure, develop a strong ego. Only afterward can it afford the luxury of seeking true meaning, of questioning its own foundations, of deconstructing what it built to reconstruct in a more authentic way. During this entire first phase of life, you live through social masks. Jung called this the persona, the character you present to the world to be accepted, respected, included. At work, you're the competent professional who meets deadlines and demonstrates efficiency. At home, you might be the dedicated father or exemplary daughter who meets family expectations. Among friends, maybe you're the funny one who relieves tension or the counselor who solves others' problems. These masks aren't lies. They're necessary. Without them, you can't function in organized society. The problem isn't using the persona. The problem is confusing the persona with who you really are underneath it. And this happens all the time. You spend so much time playing social roles that you forget you're playing them. The mask sticks to your face. You wake up one day and no longer know where the performance ends and where the real person begins. As years pass, living only through the persona starts to exact a high psychological price. You wake up one day and realize you're tired of pretending. Not necessarily pretending to be someone completely different, but pretending that this edited and socially palatable version of you is enough for an entire lifetime. Each social interaction starts to drain energy instead of generating genuine satisfaction. You find yourself avoiding people, cancelling commitments you would have automatically accepted before, seeking more time alone without knowing exactly why. It's not necessarily clinical depression. It's the psychic body asking for space to breathe, to exist without constant performance. The mask is suffocating the face underneath it, and the more you try to maintain the facade, the more energy you spend, until you reach a point where you simply can't take it anymore. Then a strange and disconcerting emptiness emerges. You look at your life objectively and see everything that should make you happy according to social standards. Stable job, established family, long-time friends, concrete achievements, material comfort. But the internal sensation is of living on the surface of yourself. Nothing seems genuine. Nothing seems truly yours. It's as if you're watching your own life from outside, following a script written by someone else. Many people interpret this as personal failure, as ingratitude in the face of the blessings they have, as character weakness or inability to appreciate what they've achieved. But Jung understood it in a radically different way. This emptiness isn't pathology that needs to be medicated or suppressed. It's a sign that a psychological phase has naturally come to an end. You've exhausted the possible meaning of that life model based on external adaptation. The psyche is asking for transformation, evolution to the next stage of development. It's precisely here that what popular culture calls the midlife crisis emerges. But crisis isn't the adequate word. Crisis suggests a problem to be solved quickly, an anomaly that went wrong, a deviation that needs to be corrected. Jung saw this moment as a natural turning point, inevitable and absolutely necessary for complete psychological development. It's when the ego, which has always commanded the orchestra of consciousness with a firm hand, realizes it can no longer maintain absolute control over the entire psyche. Something greater is emerging from the depths, something that was always there, but was ignored, suppressed, postponed during the entire race for survival and social acceptance. Calling this a crisis is not understanding the developmental function of this process. It's a necessary transition, not a pathological collapse. It's metamorphosis, or transformation. What's really happening in this moment is the beginning of what Jung called the individuation process. Individuation is the psychological process of becoming who you truly are in essence, not who you tried to be to please the external world and its infinite demands. Until 40 years old, life is dominated almost completely by external requirements. Your family of origin expects specific behavior from you. Society demands conformity to collective norms. Work imposes rhythm and way of being. Relationships ask for constant adaptations. You go molding your conscious personality to fit these multiple expectations, cutting pieces of yourself that don't fit, suppressing impulses that aren't socially acceptable. After 40, the deep psyche begins to actively reject this external molding. An intense and non-negotiable need arises to live according to your own essential nature, not according to the social manual of success and acceptance. And this need comes with irresistible force. Either you listen and transform, or you get sick in various ways. One of the first concrete signs of individuation beginning is the inevitable encounter with the personal shadow. Shadow, in Jungian vocabulary, is everything you repressed to be socially acceptable and psychologically comfortable. The impulses that didn't fit your idealized image, the desires that contradicted your moral obligations, the parts of you that caused shame or intense fear, the aspects you judged too negative to integrate into conscious identity. For entire decades, you systematically pushed all of this to the dark basement of the psyche, locked the door, pretended it didn't exist. But the shadow doesn't disappear from being ignored. It accumulates in the unconscious, gains density and strength of its own, and eventually demands recognition in increasingly insistent ways. You begin to perceive anger you didn't consciously know you carried, envy you never admitted feeling, sexual or aggressive desires you always denied possessing, ambitions you judged too petty to acknowledge. Not to completely identify with these things and live through them without filter, but to consciously integrate them, recognize they're legitimate parts of you, stop spending psychic energy fighting against aspects of yourself. Shadow integration doesn't make you a worse person. It makes you a more complete and honest person. In this deep transformation process, the ego loses absolute center stage in the psychic theater. During the entire first half of life, the ego was the undisputed protagonist of your personal narrative. It made decisions based on conscious logic, defined directions based on external goals, controlled the narrative you told about yourself. But now something deeper and broader wants to express itself through you. Jung called this the self, with a capital S, the regulating center of the total psyche that transcends the conscious ego. The self represents psychic totality, including conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, persona and authenticity. The ego becomes just one part of the total story, not the entire story. And this profoundly frightens most people, because it means giving up total control. accepting that you don't command everything that happens inside you, recognizing that there's psychic wisdom beyond your conscious will and your rational plans. But it's precisely this controlled surrender, this partial letting go of egoic control, that opens space for deeper and truer psychological life. You begin to listen to what Jung would call the voice of the soul, which is different from the voice of the social ego. Decisions that were previously made automatically based on social logic and external expectations now pass through the internal criterion of authenticity. What others will think or how they'll react doesn't matter as much anymore. What fundamentally matters is whether that resonates with something true and essential inside you. It's not late adolescent rebellion. It's genuine psychological maturity. You're not rejecting the external world on principle. You're finally learning to live in it without constantly betraying yourself, without completely abandoning your essence to fit into others' molds. Choices become slower, more deliberate, more conscious, because now you're consulting an internal compass that didn't exist before in a clear way, or that existed but was completely silenced by the deafening noise of external demands. The perception of time changes radically and irreversibly. In youth, time seems infinite and inexhaustible. You postpone important projects, procrastinate difficult decisions, naively believe there will always be another chance, another year, another decade to do what really matters. After 40, the finitude of existence becomes viscerally evident, not necessarily in a morbid or depressive way, but in an absolutely real and inescapable way. You perceive in body and mind that you won't have time to do everything you imagined, that some doors have already closed permanently, that some opportunities won't return. And instead of generating paralyzing despair, this frequently brings crystalline focus. You stop dispersing precious psychic energy on things that fundamentally don't matter to your soul. Each decision starts to carry more existential weight. Each moment gains the possibility of full presence. Time stops being something abstract you possess in abundance and becomes something concrete and limited that you consciously live. This acute awareness of mortality, far from paralyzing, frequently propels toward more authentic and urgent action. Things you consciously abandoned in youth begin to reappear in unexpected ways. That artistic talent you dropped because it didn't make enough money for responsible adult life. That travel dream you postponed indefinitely because it wasn't practical or sensible. That type of relationship you avoided because it didn't fit traditional life planning. That lifestyle you rejected because the family would disapprove. All of this comes back, not as vague and useless nostalgia, but as concrete and insistent psychic calling. The psyche is actively recovering parts of you that were prematurely sacrificed at the altar of social adaptation and economic survival. And now there's finally real psychological space for these excluded parts. Because you no longer need to prove worth to anyone. You no longer need to fit perfectly into narrow molds. You no longer need to sacrifice everything genuine in you to be accepted or respected. Voluntary solitude stops being something to desperately avoid and becomes psychologically necessary. Not solitude in the sense of painful abandonment or pathological isolation, but in the sense of conscious and deliberate withdrawal. You increasingly need time alone, without external demands, to hear your own internal voice, without constant interference from social noise. Superficial and repetitive conversations start to deeply tire you. Noisy and empty parties completely lose their meaning. Obligatory social events become a heavy burden. You actively seek silence, nature, spaces where the psyche can finally breathe without performance. This isn't pathological isolation that needs to be treated. It's psychological maturation that needs to be respected. It's the developed capacity to sustain your own company without needing constant external distraction to avoid confronting yourself. And in this deliberately sought silence, psychologically important and transformative things naturally emerge from the depths. Traditional external ambition loses motivating force, not because you cowardly give up on life or become passive and resigned, but because the internal criteria for success fundamentally change. You no longer necessarily want to be the richest, the most publicly recognized, the most socially admired, the one who climbed highest in the hierarchy. You increasingly want to live in internally coherent ways with real values. You want your daily actions to reflect your essential values, not the values you passively inherited from culture or tried to adopt to impress others. Success gradually stops being measured by external status and material accumulation and starts being fundamentally measured by internal integrity and authenticity. You prefer to do fewer things and do them with deep truth than to do a lot and feel you're wasting your own life on activities empty of personal meaning. And this isn't disguised laziness or rationalization of failure. It's painful lucidity about what really matters before time runs out. Life gains depth that didn't exist before. You're no longer frantically running after something that's always beyond the horizon, always unreachable. You're gradually learning to inhabit the present with more full consciousness and less anxiety about the future. Simple and everyday things recover value they had lost. A genuinely honest conversation with a close friend is worth infinitely more than 100 empty superficial interactions. Work that makes deep existential sense is worth more than an externally impressive but internally empty position. A true relationship based on authenticity is worth more than social approval based on appearances. You stop compulsively collecting experiences to show on social media and start living experiences that genuinely transform from within. Chronic hurry naturally diminishes, conscious presence organically increases, and for the first time in decades, you feel you're really alive and present in your own life, not just automatically functioning as a well-adjusted social machine. It's fundamentally for this reason that many say life really begins after 40, not because the previous years had no value or were completely wasted, but because before this age, you were still essentially setting up life's stage, building necessary external structure, learning rules of the social game, gaining repertoire of experiences, developing practical skills. All of this was absolutely necessary and had a clear developmental function. But it wasn't yet psychologically full life in the Jungian sense. It was necessary preparation for full life. At 40 years old, you finally developed sufficient psychological maturity to begin truly living from the inside out. To make fundamental decisions based on who you essentially are, not on who you should be according to others' expectations. To consciously integrate light and shadow, to deeply accept that you're contradictory, imperfect, and radically limited, and that this is not only okay, but the only possible way to be a true human being. You finally stop exhaustively fighting against your own essential nature and begin to consciously collaborate with it. Many people look at this inevitable transition with paralyzing fear. They think they'll completely lose the identity they built, that they'll become someone unrecognizable even to themselves. But frequently, the opposite happens in practice. You become more yourself than you've ever been in your entire previous life, because you finally stop forcedly trying to be the socially approved and edited version and start courageously inhabiting the real and complete version. And the real version, however imperfect and contradictory it inevitably is infinitely more alive and authentic than any perfectly polished social mask. Individuation isn't fundamentally about magically transforming into someone completely new. It's about courageously stopping pretending you're someone you never really were. It's about removing layers of social conditioning to reveal what was always underneath. Of course, this requires considerable psychological courage. It requires giving up illusory psychological security you meticulously built during entire decades. It requires directly facing parts of yourself you'd sincerely prefer not to see or acknowledge. It potentially requires disappointing important people who expected you to forever continue being the comfortable and predictable version. But the concrete alternative is living the entire rest of your life as a pale shadow of yourself. It's reaching the inevitable end and realizing with horror that you never really lived authentically. You just survived socially in an adequate but empty way. Jung repeatedly said that many neuroses characteristic of middle age aren't mental illness that needs to be suppressed. They're desperate and instinctive attempts by the deep psyche to prevent you from criminally wasting the second half of life, repeating dead patterns from the first half. They're urgent signals that something essential in you wants to be born, and you're unconsciously holding back the birth because you're afraid of the transformation. There's also a genuinely spiritual component in this individuation process. Not necessarily religious in the institutional or dogmatic sense, but spiritual in the deep sense of connection with something that transcends the small individual ego. In the first half of life, you're so completely occupied with the demands of the material world and its practical requirements that no psychic space remains for genuine transcendent questions. After 40, these existential questions become progressively inevitable and urgent. What does all this really mean? Where am I essentially going? What remains truly after I depart? What is the greater meaning of my specific existence? These aren't abstract philosophical questions to entertain an idle mind. They're concrete questions that radically reorganize life priorities, that make you completely reevaluate how you're spending your limited time, your precious energy, your unique life. And authentic answers don't come ready-made from external books or established religions. They come from courageous diving into your own deep unconscious, from honest dialogue with your own soul. Jung firmly believed that the unconscious isn't simply a passive deposit of repressed psychic garbage. It's an active source of wisdom that transcends limited conscious knowledge. It contains potentials not yet realized, universal archetypal symbols, knowledge that completely transcends individual personal experience. When you finally stop defensively fighting against the unconscious and its contents and begin to respectfully dialogue with it through careful attention to nighttime dreams, active imagination technique, or simply full attention to what spontaneously emerges in consciousness, you access deep psychological resources you didn't consciously know you possessed. Creative solutions to old problems appear unexpectedly. Life directions suddenly become clear. Not because someone external authoritatively told you what to do, but because something deep in you already knew the answer. It just needed conscious space and respectful attention to manifest clearly. Another absolutely crucial aspect of this process is gradual reconciliation with internal opposites. Jung saw the human psyche as a dynamic field of tension between complementary polarities. Masculine and feminine, light and shadow, rational and irrational, order and chaos, construction and destruction. In youth anxious for clear definition, you tend to rigidly identify with a specific pole and defensively reject the other. If you're a heterosexual man, you actively repress everything you consider feminine in yourself. If you're a highly rational person, you disdain and devalue the irrational. If you value order, you fear and combat chaos. But after 40, the deep psyche actively demands conscious integration of both poles. You need to honestly recognize and respectfully honor both sides of the polarity. This absolutely doesn't mean you'll become psychologically undefined or confused about identity. It means you'll become psychologically complete and integrated. You'll stop wasting energy exhaustively fighting against a legitimate half of yourself. Interpersonal relationships radically change in quality. You gradually stop desperately seeking in the other what you haven't adequately developed in yourself. You stop unconsciously projecting onto your partner qualities you need to integrate internally. You stop magically expecting someone to complete you because you finally understood that psychological completeness doesn't come from an external source. It comes fundamentally from internal integration of opposites. This doesn't make relationships less important or less valuable. On the contrary, it makes them infinitely more real and deep. You finally relate to real people in their total complexity, not to idealized and projected versions. You accept others' imperfections with more compassion because you finally accept your own imperfections. And paradoxically, this radical acceptance of reality creates the possibility of much greater and more genuine intimacy than any romantic fantasy based on projection and idealization. Professionally, many people make absolutely drastic changes in this transition phase. They quit entire careers built during decades to do something they always really wanted but never had the courage. Or they formally continue in the same professional area but completely and radically change the way of working and relating to work. Because now, work needs to make deep existential sense. It's no longer enough to simply pay the bills and guarantee material survival. It needs to feed the soul. It needs to have personal meaning. It needs to express something essential of who you are. And if it doesn't feed, if it only drains without nourishing, you simply can't stand to continue anymore. It's not childish existential crisis. It's mature alignment between external life and internal truth. It's the psyche clearly saying you no longer have precious time to waste doing something that systematically kills a piece of you every day. Some call this class privilege, but frequently, it's a natural consequence of having finally listened to your own internal voice before it was too late to change. The relationship with parents also changes profoundly. You finally manage to see them as complex and flawed human beings, not as idealized figures of absolute authority or as permanent sources of disappointment and resentment. You understand with genuine compassion that they too were only trying to survive as they could. They too carried unhealed wounds from their own stories. They too had obvious human limitations. This absolutely doesn't mean you need to lightly forgive serious abuses or pretend that real hurts didn't exist or don't matter. It means you finally stop uselessly expecting them to be radically different from what they are. You stop exhaustively fighting against the concrete reality of what your childhood was. And in this mature acceptance of reality, there's genuine possibility of psychological liberation, because you finally stop being eternally the rebellious child fighting against authority or the obedient child seeking impossible approval, and become a psychologically complete and separate adult, legitimate owner of your own life and responsible for your own choices. Death progressively stops being an abstract and distant taboo and becomes a concrete and close presence. Not necessarily in a morbid or depressive way, but in a paradoxically liberating way. Because when you finally viscerally accept you're going to die, you automatically stop indefinitely postponing real life. You stop saving the expensive china for the special occasion that statistically never arrives. You stop passively waiting for the perfect ideal moment to do what really matters. You act now. You live now. You risk now. Because now is literally the only moment that concretely exists. And this acute and constant awareness of inevitable finitude, far from paralyzing with fear, frequently propels toward more authentic and urgent action. Each limited day gains existential weight. Each choice matters profoundly. You're no longer wasting precious and irrecoverable time on things that fundamentally don't feed your soul or express your truth. There's also gradual and compassionate reconciliation with past failures. In insecure youth, failure is a deep source of shame and self-deprecation. After 40, failure becomes valuable information about limits and learnings. You honestly look back and see all the times you seriously erred, that you painfully fell, that you completely lost yourself. And instead of cruelly punishing yourself, you recognize with compassion that each mistake taught something absolutely essential. That you wouldn't be who you are now with the wisdom you have without those specific falls. This isn't forced optimism or toxic positivity. It's mature perspective conquered through real suffering. It's the developed capacity to see your own story with genuine compassion instead of cruel and relentless judgment. And from this matured self-compassion is born real psychological strength, because you no longer need to be impossibly perfect to accept yourself. You only need to be courageously real and honest. Nighttime dreams recover the central importance they had lost. Jung gave enormous and systematic attention to dreams because he deeply understood their direct messengers from the unconscious, trying to communicate with consciousness. In busy and practical youth, you completely ignore dreams, think they're just random cerebral noise without meaning. After 40, you naturally begin to pay serious attention. You write down dreams upon waking, reflect on symbolism, seek recurring patterns, because dreams are constantly showing you important aspects that rigid consciousness doesn't want to see or acknowledge. They're compensating for dangerous one-sidedness of conscious attitude. They're indicating possible directions you haven't considered, not in a literal and direct way, but in a symbolic and archetypal way. And patiently learning this deep symbolic language is like finally gaining a detailed map of your own previously unknown internal territory. Creativity radically changes in nature and motivation. It completely stops being about external production for others' consumption and becomes fundamentally about authentic internal expression. You no longer create primarily to impress others or to earn money or recognition. You create because something deep in you urgently needs to come out and manifest in the world. Whether through visual art, personal writing, amateur music, contemplative gardening, experimental cooking, the specific form doesn't matter as much. What essentially matters is that you're giving healthy outlet to psychic content that asks for expression. And this is therapeutic in the deepest possible sense. It's not therapy in the formal clinical sense. It's therapy in the original Greek sense of healing, of gradual restoration of fragmented psychological integrity. You also progressively develop psychological tolerance for paradox and ambiguity. You can sustain apparently contradictory truths simultaneously without needing to prematurely resolve the contradiction. You deeply understand you can genuinely love someone and still need physical or emotional distance, that you can be simultaneously strong and deeply vulnerable, that you can have sincere faith and honest doubt coexisting peacefully. This matured capacity to sustain psychological tension without forcing simplistic premature resolution is a clear sign of deep psychological maturity. Because real life isn't logically consistent. It's fundamentally paradoxical and contradictory, and trying to force it into rigid and mutually exclusive categories is a subtle form of psychic violence against reality itself. There's still the crucial question of personal legacy, not in the superficial sense of leaving your name carved in stone or accumulating fortune, but in the deep sense of significant contribution. You naturally begin to think about what you'll effectively leave behind when you depart. Not in terms of material goods that will be divided, but in terms of the real impact your existence had. How did your actions concretely affect other people? What values are you transmitting through living example? What difference does your specific existence make in the world? These questions aren't narcissistic or self-centered. They're questions from someone who finally understood they're part of something infinitely greater than themselves. That individual life is inevitably intertwined with collective life, and that you have ethical responsibility in this web of interdependence. Friendships become radically more selective and intentional. You no longer need an artificially broad social circle to feel validated or important. You consciously prefer few true and deep friends to many superficial and empty acquaintances. And these deep friendships are nurtured with genuine care and constant attention. Because you viscerally know time is a limited resource, and you want to spend it primarily with who really essentially matters. With whom you can be completely vulnerable without fear. With whom you don't need to wear a social mask. These authentic relationships become a source of genuine sustenance, not from social obligation or convenience, but from conscious choice and mutual appreciation. The physical body also speaks increasingly louder. You concretely perceive you can no longer ignore it with impunity, that it has real limits, that it visibly ages, that it asks for growing attention. And this isn't necessarily sad decadence. It's a mature invitation to inhabit the body in a more conscious and respectful way, to respect its natural rhythms, to care for it not as a machine that needs to function at any cost, but as a sacred temple that temporarily houses your existence. The relationship with the body gradually stops being constant warfare and becomes collaborative partnership. And in this respectful partnership, you frequently discover subtle pleasures that youth obsessed with maximum performance never knew or valued. You also finally stop obsessively comparing your life with others. You finally understand deep down that each path is absolutely unique, that the other's apparent success isn't automatically your personal failure, that you're not desperately competing with anyone in an imaginary race. You're just living your own specific journey with all its particularities, and this progressive liberation from constant comparison is one of the most valuable gifts of this phase, because it allows you to genuinely celebrate others' achievements without feeling diminished. It allows you to recognize your own achievements without needing them to be greater than absolutely everyone's. It allows you to simply be who you are without constant external measurement. Gratitude becomes a more constant and deep presence. Not superficial performative gratitude from an obligatory list of thanks, but visceral gratitude for simply being alive, for having reached this specific point, for having survived absolutely everything that could legitimately have destroyed you, for still having valuable time ahead. This existential gratitude doesn't naively deny real suffering. It doesn't romanticize concrete difficulties. But it recognizes that, despite absolutely everything, you're here now. And being here is miracle enough in itself. It's solid enough foundation to consciously build what still needs building before the end. So if you're precisely in this transition phase, or rapidly approaching it, and you feel something deep inside you is fundamentally changing, don't defensively resist. Don't desperately try to keep everything exactly as it was before. Don't force artificial and dead continuity. Consciously let the transformation happen in its own time. Listen with genuine attention to what your deep psyche is trying to say. Pay careful attention to nighttime dreams, to authentic impulses, to persistent discomforts. They're not a problem that needs to be suppressed. They're an internal guide showing the way. They're showing you the direction for the second half of life, the half in which you finally live according to your own essential truth, instead of others' expectations. And this truth, however scary it may initially seem, is the only thing that can genuinely set you free.